Every child who has ever sat down in front of a TV screen and switched on a video game has dreamed of stepping into a virtual world. It's a dream at the heart of many gaming experiences, and many a game has tried to fulfill it in various ways over the years, but I'm not sure any have done so as effectively as the Elder Scrolls series. These games are big, open, interactive juggernauts of player expression, but do a better job at allowing players to feel like they're exploring another world than almost any other game out there. They provide experiences players can lose themselves within, with worlds players want to believe in, that regularly eschew the traditional conventions of game design in ways that make them wholly unique. There aren't any other games like them, and years later that remains true despite both their critical and commercial success and the mainstream domination of the open world genre over the last decade. The Elder Scrolls games are an invitation to see video games as something more. This series is a celebration of what it means to be a kid and dream of exploring a whole other world. And yet, if there is one game that took that dream and crushed it into 1,000 disillusioned pieces underneath its big fat metaphorical heel, it's the Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim. How did Skyrim do that, you may ask? Is it because Skyrim is overrated, shallow, casual? Is it because Skyrim is a bad game? Well, no, my imaginary friend, Skyrim didn't kill that dream by being a bad game, it killed it by being a good game. And this is the tragedy of Skyrim. If you're sitting there right now thinking, that doesn't even make sense, maybe you should consider that it doesn't even make sense yet. But we have an hour and a half to go, and sense will be made. Believe me, I've seen the script. If you're sitting there right now thinking, what the hell have I clicked on, who is this guy? Well, maybe you should have thought of that before clicking on something that says episode 3 in the title. Really, you've only got yourself to blame here. Well, yourself and the YouTube algorithm. In fact, maybe you should blame the algorithm. Honestly, I blame the YouTube algorithm for everything wrong in my life. Still, one person that isn't to blame is me. What did I do? In the last video I said you should start at episode 1 because otherwise these videos won't make sense, and I am tempted to say that again now. However, that isn't really the whole story, and this final episode is all about the whole story, so I feel I should level with you. The truth is, you should start at episode 1 because you don't deserve to start at episode 3. You haven't earned it. For those who have, welcome back. Let's begin. Skyrim fixed Oblivion. Of course, fixed is a loaded term. A dog who gets fixed may not view the process quite as positively as their owner, and the fixing of many a thing has, I'm sure, been met with displeasure for any who disputed its status of broken to begin with. But there were parts of Oblivion that needed fixing. Still, the most important way Skyrim fixed Oblivion was how it refined Bethesda's vision. Skyrim didn't represent any major jump into the unknown like the last few entries into the series. It was on the same hardware, with the same target audience, and followed the same design priorities. Yet the changes Skyrim did make were done with a quiet confidence. It took Oblivion's already accessible and acclaimed formula and ran with it, trimming the fat, polishing its rough edges, and learning valuable lessons to produce what would end up being Bethesda's most successful game by all measurable metrics. You could describe Skyrim as like Oblivion but better, although this would be a little unfair on the latter. Such a description would fail to acknowledge the variety to Oblivion's side quests, or the strength of some of its factions, as well as the way in which Oblivion managed to foster its own strangely surreal yet comforting, low-budget, tropey fantasy atmosphere that some might find more appealing. Yet, even if this description would be unfair, it might not be that inaccurate. Much of Skyrim is similar to Oblivion, with improvements often being made in key areas, so let's focus on those changes through the lens of what Bethesda was trying to achieve with them. First up, the criticism that has haunted these games since their inception: that the combat is bad. Skyrim has several solutions to this, but they're more like mildly entertaining party tricks that it has carefully hidden up its sleeve than the radical design overhaul that might have actually been necessary to exercise this problem once and for all. For starters, you can now dual wield with both weapons and magic. This is a welcome addition, as it not only provides more choice in playstyle, something easy to appreciate in an RPG, it also introduces some element of sacrifice to using magic, as dedicating a hand to casting spells now comes at the cost of your shield or second weapon. To go alongside this, there is the introduction of Dragon Shouts, new magic-like abilities that the player gains through learning ancient words of power. These have reasonably long cooldowns, but adds an impressive variety of new abilities, and it's hard to deny the simple enjoyment that comes with seeing enemy bodies ragdoll all over the place at the hands of your Fusrodar, even if it is less enjoyable to be on the receiving end of this. Still, these shouts end up feeling badly needed, as otherwise the selection of spells available is honestly rather lackluster. The spell creation system of the previous games has been removed now, and in its absence magic is left seeming overly inflexible, as not only are there few spell types, but also each type tends to be associated with a particular spell skill level, meaning all novice destruction spells are continuously casted streams, all apprentice spell levels are simple projectiles, and so on. This means you're forced to use the one type of spell that matches your level of ability, or you risk sacrificing effectiveness, removing much of the variety and choice that should make playing a magic character enjoyable in the first place. The entire spell school of mysticism was also removed. This type of streamlining is part of a larger pattern in Skyrim, and this won't be the last we'll see of it. Still, Bethesda likely hoped these kinds of absences wouldn't be fixated upon if its core features, like combat, at least seemed better than the previous games. To this end, much more effort was placed on combat animations, with each hit now feeling weightier than the overly floaty animations that Oblivion had, and to top this off, there's also a large variety of new flashy kill animations. In some ways, these kill animations sum up Bethesda's approach to combat in this game. Skyrim added more style in order to hide the fact that its combat still has little substance. And so most of Oblivion's deeper combat problems remain, they're just less noticeable underneath the new, more presentable exterior. That said, the single biggest problem that negatively impacted Oblivion's combat has at least been fixed. In the last video, I spent a lot of time detailing the variety of negative impacts Oblivion's level scaling could have, but one thing I may not have emphasized enough was just how tedious scaled enemies made combat encounters. Once you reached mid-game, Oblivion assaulted the player with a non-stop onslaught of overly tanky enemies that were so time-consuming to hack your way through over and over again that it made combat often feel like a chore. In Skyrim, these hit point inflated enemies are no longer the norm, and while this was an obvious change that really says more about Oblivion's failings than Skyrim's successes, it's still an important change. But Skyrim doesn't just tweak a few numbers to remedy a couple of Oblivion's more egregious oversights. It takes this opportunity of a second chance to try to earnestly repent for many of the level scaling's erstwhile errors. Where Oblivion scaled all enemies to the player's level, Skyrim instead divides its enemies into those with a fixed level and those that scale, with the scaling enemies now having a minimum and maximum level, meaning the player can still encounter dangerous enemies even early in the experience and can still gain that sense of progression that comes with feeling your character grow in power relative to some of the world's other inhabitants. Skyrim also has answers to some of the more immersion-breaking aspects of the previous game's scaling. Entire species of animals are no longer removed from the game world when the player passes a certain level threshold, and where Oblivion had a tendency to hand out legendary equipment to any and all of its world's inhabitants with the enthusiasm of a kindly grandparent giving out candy on Halloween, in Skyrim, bandit equipment is now restricted to a much more lore-appropriate level. Enemies aren't the only feature to be scaled more effectively either. Unique items and artifacts are no longer tied to the player's level, and this, in conjunction with changes to human enemy loot tables, allows rare and powerful equipment to feel much more valuable now. The changes the scaling Skyrim makes aren't radical. They're intelligent, targeted decisions designed to fix the last game's core problems, while still allowing for a world where players can tackle any content in the order they choose, without feeling like they're being punished for their selections. The sheer quantity of Draugr the player faces can still make the scaling of this particular group of enemies feel overly noticeable, but for the most part Skyrim is able to scale its world without the act of scaling breaking immersion or ruining progression. Speaking of progression, we come to another area subject to Skyrim's patented fat trimming, and it's one that Bethesda took to streamlining with the enthusiasm of an overachieving aeronautical engineer. You'll notice this as soon as you create your character, as instead of choosing a class with major skills, a specialization and a favoured birth sign, you now only choose your race and appearance. In fact, there's no mention of anything stat related at all. Character creation is a 100% number-free exercise, and even the small differences between races that do still exist are left being unspecified, with nothing but some vague racial descriptions to go off that merely suggest some races might be better at certain activities. Clearly, stats are not what Bethesda intended for players to be thinking about at this stage, and that won't change much later either. Most skills still exist at least, but the core attribute system doesn't, with level ups now providing one skill perk and a single stat bonus to either your health, stamina or magic bar. This choice is less interesting than the previous one of increasing 3 attributes out of 7, where you had different bonuses based on your skill advancement that level. In fact, the new choice is so straightforward that it hardly feels worth participating in. Increasing stamina has little value outside of increasing carrying capacity for the lazy. Magic is only useful for magic users, and even then it's not as useful as magic cost reduction from equipment, and health is fine, I guess. It's health, you can hardly go wrong with a greater bodily capacity for in-game beatings. So you may as well just increase health every time, until you reach the point where picking the same option on every level up starts to make you feel like you have a personality defect, and so you switch to just picking at random in a vain attempt to seem like a less boring person. Still, at least you don't need to worry about leveling inefficiently anymore. Although, in my opinion, being overly boring is a greater cardinal sin than being bad, and I can't help but look at Skyrim's new, refined progression system and wonder if part of the reason for these changes was as a passive-aggressive fuck you to all the players who left the previous games on auto-run or jumped up and down for 4 hours to artificially game the previous systems. This makes it feel a bit like a teacher punishing the entire class for the actions of the badly behaved few, and I don't really appreciate being treated this way by a video game. I'm an adult, and innocent, and I would like my attribute selection back. I promise I'll play nicely. To this end, the added selection of 1 skill perk per level was badly needed to remedy the character progression's lack of depth, but unfortunately, perks have their own problems. Still, there's nothing wrong with the idea. It clearly came from Bethesda's earlier title Fallout 3, which was borrowing from the original Fallout games, and adding this system to the Elder Scrolls doesn't seem like a bad plan. Perks add more character choice, which can be packaged in an easily digestible format for players to scoff down at regular intervals to customize their character and playstyle. That said, Skyrim's perk system ended up as a sinkhole of wasted potential, mostly due to its overly restrictive structure. Each skill has its own perk tree, but to access the later perks you have to first acquire the early perks, in addition to reaching a high enough skill level. This limits the amount of options available to the player, while forcing them to invest into less useful and less interesting perks for multiple level ups, just to get to the few perks they actually want. Bethesda also seemed afraid of making any perk too valuable, leaving some entire trees in an existential crisis of purposelessness. Take lockpicking. In Skyrim you can pick any lock in game regardless of your lockpicking skill or your lockpicking perks. This is already a questionable design decision. I know no one likes finding a shiny treasure chest only to discover they're not able to get their grubby paws on its content because of the lock level, but experiencing the displeasure of this is precisely what makes later being able to avoid these situations all the more satisfying. That's basically how progression works, and in an RPG this tends to be a good thing. But even ignoring this, the lockpicking perks themselves are still terrible. 5 of the perks just exist to make each tier of lock easier to pick. The problem with these is that the lockpicking minigame is already mechanically easy. The only thing that can make it difficult is having a lockpicking skill level that's too low for the lock in question, but each of these perks has a skill level requirement, meaning the only way to get them is to have a high enough skill level that you already don't need them, because easier lockpicking is only useful on locks higher than your skill level, but you can only get the easier lockpicking perks for locks lower than your skill level. This is absurd. Making easy locks even easier is pointless. Lockpicks are already everywhere in this game, and even if they weren't, lockpicks are dirt cheap. And I don't want to lecture you on Tamrielian economics, but there ain't no lack of dirt in this place, I'll tell you that much. And then we have the other 6 perks. Let's go through them one by one. Quick Hands allows you to pick locks unnoticed, but when would that actually be useful? This perk doesn't allow you to steal unnoticed, so you'd still end up having to avoid line of sight in these situations anyway. Wax Key gives you a copy of a picked lock's key, but if you have to pick the lock to get the key, you obviously don't need the key anymore, do you? Golden Touch gives more gold in chests, which sounds nice, but almost all gold in Skyrim comes from selling items, and gold isn't very useful anyway. So even if this perk isn't entirely worthless, that doesn't mean it's worth investing in 3 other perks that are worthless to get it. Treasure Hunter gives a 50% greater chance to find special treasure, which sounds really impressive until you look into how it works and realise it's only certain chests, and it only gives you a chance to find 1 extra item in them, and it's only a 50% increase, meaning your base 10% chance to find an extra item is increased to 15%, which is a lot less impressive. And this is why percentages are for liars. Wake up, people, this is how they get you. Locksmith means lockpicks start closer to the correct position, but to get this you need 80 skill level, and to first acquire all of the easier lockpicking perks except master level, meaning lockpicking would already be so easy by this point that I refuse to believe there is anyone who would need an extra perk to make it even easier. Lastly, Unbreakable means lockpicks never break, but lockpicks are literally the same price as dirt. So, unless you want to avoid lockpick wastage for environmental reasons, lockpicks breaking doesn't matter. There are 11 perks in this tree, and every single one of them is trash. Why couldn't the perks that make each tier of lock easier just make picking locks of that tier automatic? Would that really be too much? Is the lockpicking minigame really meant to be so enjoyable that perks that allow us to skip low-level locks would be such a travesty? And what about the fact that you need a skill level of 100 to even be allowed to acquire the Unbreakable and Master Locks perks? In 80 hours of intense Skyrim playing, where I picked every single lock I encountered, I reached a lockpick skill of 79. So it would likely take over 100 hours of game playing and lockpicking to even unlock these high level perks, and after all that, these are the rewards you get. It's almost as if the only reason a lot of these perks exist is just to make the perk tree look like a lockpick. But how something looks when arranged as a tree is not the main thing you should use to design your game's systems around. Now, I don't want to go through every single perk tree listing every single problem I have with Skyrim's perks just to prove a point. Well, that's not entirely true. I do kind of want to go through every single perk tree listing every single problem I have with Skyrim's perks, because that sounds like a good time, and there are worse ways to spend your Saturday night, believe me. But I won't do that, right now at least, because this point doesn't require that much to be proven. Skyrim's perks are almost all either boring or bad, and those few which aren't are locked behind multiple other perks that are, which, when combined with the high skill levels needed to even access them, makes the choice of which perk to choose on level up feel more like a desperate search to find at least one option that isn't terrible, rather than any kind of actual reward. I'm not trying to say Skyrim's perk system is so bad it ruins the game or anything. I do think perks are a good addition, and Skyrim is by no means the only modern game with perk-related problems, but honestly, I could make a better perk system than this in my sleep, and I mean that. Seriously, record what I say in my sleep for the rest of my life, and I guarantee you, someone could assemble a better perk selection than Skyrim's. And I'm not even trying to brag here, I'm just saying, if any Bethesda employee is watching, and they are willing to purchase my sleep mutterings, hit me up, because while this knowledge wouldn't come cheap, I'm sure we could work something out. So, Skyrim's streamlined progression systems are not better than Oblivion's or Morrowind's, but they could be considered less broken. The price Skyrim paid to achieve this was that the choices it presents to players aren't as interesting anymore, but what you or me might call uninteresting, a professional games critic or casual player might call accessible or polished. So while I would never claim to agree with these changes, I do understand them, and I think for many who played Skyrim they might have represented a net positive. Moving on to a universal positive, we have the world building. After Morrowind's otherworldly brilliance, Oblivion's setting was criticised for coming across as more generic and shallow. A big reason for Bethesda's change in direction was that they wanted to create a setting that was more traditional, something that felt familiar and would be more marketable. Skyrim's setting straddles the line between the two previous games, and while it's not nearly as unique or memorable as Vvardenfell, it is arguably more marketable than Cyrodiil, with enough of Vvardenfell's depth and distinctiveness to make it a satisfactory middle ground. The sense of identity provided by snow, Vikings and dragons is hardly revolutionary, but this does at least bestow Skyrim with more individuality than Oblivion had. Still, the really important change is that this world now has underlying stories and conflicts that define its people and culture beyond just whatever is happening in the main story. The most obvious example here is the Civil War, which provides a secondary conflict to the main story that relates to the region's political and religious tensions, and which the player is able to engage with in accordance to their own beliefs. There are other conflicts to this region as well though. Marketh has the Forsworn rebellions, Riften has crime and corruption, Windhelm has immigration and racism, Winterhold the city has Winterhold the college, and so on. The Jarls of Skyrim also have more purpose and personality than Oblivion's Count ever did, and the side quests in this game are more likely to tie into the region's history and backstory than previously. Overall, Skyrim's world building is a lot better than Oblivion's, and while this doesn't mean it's better than Morrowind, this is still a significant step in the right direction. Another step in the right direction is Skyrim's overall improved presentation. Oblivion was janky, the voice acting suffered from too few actors, the mini-games were weird, and the main story occasionally came across as more kids' nativity play than professional theatrical production. Skyrim is better in this regard. It's more graphically consistent. The world no longer freezes in place anytime you speak to one of its inhabitants, the persuasion minigame no longer exists, and the main story is more careful when it comes to avoiding moments it might struggle to present to players. Skyrim just looks and feels like a higher budget production, and, importantly, Oblivion's greatest feature, the strong visual design of its world, is still very much intact. In fact, Skyrim's environments look incredible. From towering snowy mountain peaks to forlorn foggy marshlands or warm autumnal forests, the diversity and richness of this game's locations manage to feature both a genuine sense of authenticity as well as a handcrafted level of quality. Visually, Skyrim's setting is a joy to behold, and it hasn't sacrificed scale or level of detail to achieve this. So, where do all these changes leave Skyrim? Well, after further mainstreamification at the hands of its developers, Skyrim is undoubtedly closer to being the game Bethesda wanted Oblivion to be. An RPG that can be enjoyed by anyone, which excels at drawing players in through the strength of its world and the accessibility of its design, and is then able to provide hours of entertainment through its openness and near unrivaled quantity of content. With Skyrim, Bethesda effectively doubled down. Their solution to criticisms of level scaling wasn't to remove it, but instead to just do it better. Their solution to the messiness of the older Elder Scrolls games' progression systems was to keep cutting away at them until they were left with something lesser, but cleaner. Their solution to a main story that struggled to come across as epic as it wanted to be was to increase the level of presentation of the rest of the game so that desired epicness could be better supported. And where problems existed that Bethesda didn't have a solution to, like the shallow combat, they were still ready to slap on a new coat of paint to ensure there was at least an impression of progress. And honestly, it worked. This is the best-selling RPG of all time. But this isn't a video about sales. It's a video about dreams, and there's more to Skyrim's changes than meets the eye. Over the last 5 or 10 years, I've noticed a particular term rise to ascendancy amongst video game critics that's used to describe what you do in games. That term is gameplay loop, and I don't like this term. Maybe this is because in my formative game playing years, I cared little for loops, and nor did anyone else. And so I never understood why years later we all needed to start seeing games through loop-shaped lenses to better understand what you do in them, when you can already understand what you do in them by just doing it. Or maybe it's because terms like gameplay loop remind me of my time in university, where I spent several years being taught to wield certain academically approved terms to describe normal things in abnormal ways in order to gain greater grades, and an overinflated sense of self-importance that stemmed not from anything of actual substance, but instead just from the fact that we used words other people don't. Or maybe it's because it taps into my insecurities as a game critic. After all, I don't use terms like gameplay loop, or game feel, or systemic design, and I've never even used the term ludonarrative dissonance to complain about a game. Not even once. Maybe that means I'm not a real game critic. What is a real game critic? I don't know, but I'm not sure I meet whatever the criteria is, and maybe that's a problem. So, thanks, Gameplay Loop. Still, I would argue the reason I dislike Gameplay Loop so much is because it's reductive. It asks us to view games in a way that I don't think they should be viewed, as products of their most frequently reoccurring parts, as if playing a game is all about mechanical repetition, instead of, say, the feelings a game evokes. Gameplay Loop asks us to view games as games, but maybe games are at their best when we do the opposite, when we stop seeing them as games and instead see them as challenges to overcome, or stories to uncover, or worlds to lose ourselves within. And through defining a loop, we turn our backs on everything outside the loop that supports the loop, as if these loops are neatly defined and easily extracted instead of being intimately related to all the non-loop parts of the game. What I'm saying is, I don't think gameplay loop is a good term. I don't like its connotations. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with people who use it. Maybe this is a me thing. Maybe there are just certain things I have to work through on my own. I don't know. But what I do know is that Skyrim seems like a game that was designed by people who love the term gameplay loop. Step 1 is acquiring the quest. As this is the start of the loop, it is therefore the most important step, and so no chances were taken to allow the player to ever miss this step and find themselves outside the loop. To this end, Skyrim offers up a constant barrage of new things to do at a steady pace throughout the experience that is mathematically designed to ensure players always have just slightly more to do than they're ever capable of actually doing. In most games, players find quests themselves. In Skyrim, we reverse this, so the quests instead find you. Literally, NPCs like couriers are programmed to periodically appear to force-feed the player new quests in the form of letters from Jarls they've never heard of, but who have heard of them and want them to come solve their problems. And you know what? The player will, because they don't know how to say no to quests. Literally, we gave them no option to say no. The quests just appear in their journal whether they like it or not, so the only way to get rid of them is by capitulating to their every demand. And that's what the player does. With the quest acquired and its accompanying exposition explained, players will then have their objective. This leads us to step 2. The objective is represented in the form of a little arrow, a now iconic icon displayed on map and compass alike, which players can use to find the objective. Which they do by simply pressing the move button while facing the direction the arrow tells them to, ensuring that sooner or later even the dumbest of players will end up in the place we want them to be. During this journey, players are encouraged to enjoy the scenic scenery of the overworld. It does look rather nice, and there are a number of attractions for players to witness on their way from one location to another. Maybe there'll be a giant with his pet mammoth. Cute. Maybe there'll be a randomly generated NPC interruption. How unexpected. Maybe there'll be a dragon. Exciting. These events were created to make the world seem more alive, without actually doing anything to make it more alive. For those more impatient, they can also open their map and fast travel to the nearest discovered location for a shorter journey. This ensures that even the busiest of players don't feel like their time is being wasted. Even if it is. Once the player arrives at their objective, they'll discover what it is. Surprise, it's a dungeon. Actually, it's always a dungeon. This is Skyrim after all, and this is for good reason. It's in these dungeons that the magic happens. Anyway, time for the player to head inside and see what adventure awaits them. Wow, it's Draugrs. Oh Skyrim, you and your Draugrs, they never get old. Literally, they're undead. They don't age. Well, not to worry. Now the player is inside the dungeon, they are safely in the hands of the Skyrim mini-loop of walk, kill, loot, repeat, walk, kill, loot, repeat, walk, kill, loot, repeat, until the dungeon is complete. To ensure combat doesn't feel pointless, despite the vast amount of it against the exact same enemies, the player is fed a constant drip feed of skill increases and level ups that now have a much more impactful sound effect and on-screen message to titillate players' shriveled up dopamine receptors by making them think they've accomplished something of value. Oh, wow, you've increased your one-handed skill. Good job, that's sure to impress members of the opposite sex. To go alongside this, loot has been placed periodically throughout the dungeon in evenly spaced containers, whose content has been scientifically formulated to always contain just enough of value to make sure players always feel like they should search each one, and yet not enough of value to make players ever feel like they have enough random stuff that they don't need to keep searching them. Hey, maybe there's a Daedric sword in that next chest. You better not be thinking of skipping it. Oh, it's not a Daedric sword this time. Well, you better take this stuff anyway to sell later. There's no such thing as too much gold, after all. Of course, this isn't strictly true. Well, yes, gold has no weight, and so the player in theory can never have too much of it. In practice, they'll have too much gold after only a few hours, because there's nothing to spend it on. I mean, what are you gonna do? Buy a Daedric sword? I don't think so, buddy. Even after 100 hours, the best these vendors can do is glass, and even that will only be when you're lucky. You see, we made sure there's nothing of value to spend your money on in Skyrim, because players can't run out of things to spend money on if there's never anything to spend it on in the first place. This may sound ineffective, but so deep is greed interwoven into the human condition that just seeing a number next to the word gold get bigger and bigger is all the motivation most players will need to keep searching through every container, to pick up every last piece of junk, to then repeat the laborious process of visiting different vendors to sell your various trash. This may sound rather tedious, but it's a tedium the player will feel is a result of their choice and clever money management, and so will avoid blaming the game for. Oh, what's that you've got there? Wow, that is a lot of gold. Don't spend it all at once. Loot and killing is important, but we don't want to keep players in dungeons for too long. That's why through mass data analysis, our statisticians have calculated 32 minutes, 55 seconds and 28 milliseconds to be the ideal dungeon length, so as to feel not so long as to become overwhelming, and yet not so short that the accomplishment of beating the dungeon feels insignificant. Of course, we couldn't make every dungeon 32 minutes, 55 seconds and 28 milliseconds long. That would be ridiculous. And so we used a standard deviation of 1.875 to provide a level of variation that feels natural to the player without ever moving into the uncomfortable realms of too short or too long. Now, the more cynical of the human populace might argue that despite our previous efforts, dungeons themselves are still too repetitive, but the pièce de résistance is what awaits players at the end of the dungeon. You see, we know through our psychological analysis of the human mind that the cognitive biases of the peak end rule will ensure the final part of the experience will be the most memorable, and so not only do we allow the player to complete the quest objective that brought them here in the first place, we also throw in a boss fight encounter, a large shiny chest with better loot than any of the others, and often a unique word of power whose custom-made animation and sound effect really make the player feel special. As such, the player is showered in endorphin-releasing stimulants to let them know what a good job they did and encourage them to immediately begin the process all over again as soon as they fast travel back and hand the quest in. Now, that's what I call a loop. With the Radiant quest system that's able to create a never-ending stream of new randomly generated quests, and dungeons that repopulate after 10 to 30 in-game days, the award-winning Skyrim loop literally never ends, ensuring complete player satisfaction for the rest of their pathetic lives. This loop is so effective that even players who don't like this game still have an average of over 200 hours of in-game time logged on Steam. So just imagine what happens to those who do like it. Do you remember in the first episode of this analysis when I spent 21 minutes explaining how the appeal of the Elder Scrolls games is all about their worlds and getting to explore them? How this is the most important part of these games, the thing that makes them so special and draws people to them and makes people fall in love with them. Well, how exactly does that fit with Skyrim's gameplay loop? You see, I don't actually think there's anything insidious about Skyrim's gameplay loop. Video games are designed to keep players engaged. They do this through conscious decisions made by their developers, and there's nothing wrong with that, particularly if the game isn't trying to create this engagement for the end purpose of some kind of further monetization method. And I also don't think Skyrim's gameplay loop is especially bad. Skyrim is good at making your in-game actions feel rewarding, and it's clear Bethesda have picked up several clever tips and tricks through their past game experiences to help accomplish this. Like how they noticed players enjoyed following their compass to find new locations in Oblivion, so now you get a more noticeable pop-up message as well as a sound effect to make it seem like your discovery of this location means something. Skyrim's gameplay loop is full of these kinds of small tweaks and optimizations that result in an experience that is easy to pick up and sink many hours into, all while generally feeling pretty well entertained. But even if I don't think it's insidious or bad game design, I do think that Skyrim's gameplay loop, on some level, fundamentally misses the entire point of the Elder Scrolls series. These games are meant to be about virtual worlds and their exploration, but Bethesda have ended up ignoring this to instead focus on the refinement of an overly gamified loop of repetitive actions that seems designed to keep players trudging through dungeons as much as humanly possible, instead of exploring the world. And the dungeons aren't even good. Okay, credit where credit's due. Skyrim's dungeons do look the part. Do you remember dungeons in Oblivion? There were 4 types: forts, caves, mines, and Aelid ruins. All dungeons of a specific type looked near identical, meaning if you've seen one, you've seen them all, and while there were a few exceptions to this, when I say few, I mean it. Also, I'm pretty sure mines and caves are basically the same thing. Stop trying to pretend they're meaningfully different, Oblivion. The separate icons aren't fooling anyone. In Skyrim, there are 5 main types of dungeons: forts, caves, mines, Nordic tombs, and Dwemer ruins. Only one more archetype, and the return of both caves and mines may not make Skyrim's dungeons seem like much of a step up, but the mines of Skyrim are no longer quite so similar to the caves. Also, there's now a much greater variety within each type of dungeon. Skyrim has many great looking dungeons. Right about now is where I would love to show a really nice dungeon montage, maybe something like a quick top 10 dungeon designs in Skyrim list that could communicate my point in a fun and effective way. However, I have over 100 hours of recorded footage for this game, and I did not make any kind of timestamp notes or sorting system to make finding specific dungeon footage easier, so there will not be a montage or a top 10 list, because creating such a thing out of my jumbled mess of footage would be an editing nightmare. I guess then I'll just have to settle for showing off a few random examples in the background and just saying my point. Which is, these dungeons look pretty good. They're a lot more distinctive than previous games in the series, and that distinctiveness can contain moments of true visual spectacle. I mean, as Lydia likes to put it,
I've never seen anything quite like that.
And she isn't wrong, even if the amount she repeats this phrase is very annoying. Still, some dungeons go even further than just looking good by incorporating their visual design into the location's story. My favourite example of this is Broken Ore Grotto, which is a coastal cave containing a half-sunken pirate ship that became trapped within after part of the cave collapsed years earlier, and has now been converted into the headquarters of a local bandit group. You can uncover this story by reading a journal you find here, but you don't even need to read that journal for the visuals of this location to communicate much of this story to you. The result is this location is so much more than just another cave, and in this particular way, nothing in Morrowind, Oblivion or Daggerfall can ever really compete with Skyrim. Not every dungeon in Skyrim feels unique. Not every dungeon is visually impressive. Not every dungeon has a story. But enough are that Skyrim can easily claim to set a new standard for the series when it comes to visual design alone. And yet, despite the vastly improved appearance, mechanically these dungeons remain superficial. Combat has never been a strength of the series, and yet combat is the main activity you do in dungeons. A lot of time is spent in side dungeons in Skyrim, which means a lot of time is spent in combat in Skyrim, and there is still little by way of challenge or strategy to the vast majority of these encounters, leaving this, the main activity of the game, feeling repetitive and shallow. Still, there are other ways to add depth to a dungeon, other ways that Skyrim also fails at. For example, depth could be added through in-game traps to make navigating a dungeon dangerous. Except traps in Skyrim still do so little damage that they barely qualify as minor annoyances. You could add puzzles to a dungeon. I mean, as anyone who has played Zelda knows, few things go as well together as dungeons and puzzles. And Skyrim has puzzles, except there's just one type. This may not have been quite so bad if that one puzzle was at least good, but all it asks you to do is match the symbols in the environment with the symbols on the movable pillars. There are some slight variations to this, but not many, and they are only slight. Now, I have completed entire games full of puzzles, and these puzzles can be quite hard. Even when I was an idiot child, I was able to almost complete Ocarina of Time, and I am many years away from being an idiot child. Not that I'm trying to brag or anything, but I do believe I could handle something a little harder than matching a set of images. I also believe birds could handle matching images. I mean, I'm no expert, but I've seen videos, and they seem like they're up for the challenge. So, maybe Bethesda could design their puzzles for an audience somewhere above the level of intelligence of the average pigeon. Maybe I'm being a little overly harsh here, but then again, in the very final dungeon of Skyrim's main story, you still just match symbols with those in the environment, so maybe I'm not. Still, puzzles are a mostly new addition to dungeons, so we can't hold their simplicity against the game too strongly. The same can't be said about the dungeon layouts, which are more linear than ever before, meaning all navigating them entails is proceeding forwards in a mostly straight line. I don't want to see the series return to daggerfall levels of labyrinthian layouts, but straight lines aren't exactly exciting either. And, honestly, nor is any part of Skyrim's dungeons gameplay. Whether you're looting or shooting, it never feels all that interesting. This mechanical shallowness might have been easy to forgive if these dungeons were more thematically interesting, but most of them don't manage that either. Because, in many ways, every dungeon in Skyrim could be the same dungeon. For example, each dungeon is full of enemies. You may say, of course they are, they're dungeons, that's how dungeons are, but why does every dungeon need to be full of similarly sized groups of evenly spaced enemies? Why can't there sometimes be empty dungeons? If these locations were real, surely there'd be at least some that were uninhabited, and it's not like a short break from combat would be such a travesty. Or why not have some dungeons that seem mostly empty and have maybe just one or two combat encounters? This way the dungeon can build suspense, and then when combat does happen it would be unexpected, which could work great in a dungeon with a more foreboding atmosphere. Or why can't there be some dungeons filled with non-hostile inhabitants? Why does every bandit have to attack you on sight anyway, as if they're all blood-crazed psychopaths? Surely sometimes a bandit might respond to an unknown adventurer by just telling them to go away. Then you have aspects like the loot. I know loot tables are a thing in games, and they're not unique to Skyrim, but over the course of an average playthrough you become so intimately familiar with Skyrim's loot tables for certain containers, but you tend to know exactly what you'll find inside many things before you even open them, resulting in a level of predictability that's not just boring, it's immersion breaking. And why is loot so evenly spaced out? Why does every location even have loot? Surely it would make sense for some locations to have already been looted. And then there are those big chests you get at the end of dungeons. Why do so many dungeons have these exact same large chests in the exact same location, i.e. the final room of the dungeon? And why do they always contain the best loot? And what about the dungeon structure? Most dungeons are linear, even if they try to visually disguise this, and for locations like forts, tombs or Dwemer ruins, a linear structure wouldn't necessarily make sense. And then what about the shortcuts? Almost every sizable dungeon in this game has a shortcut at the end of it, so the player can exit quickly. This addresses a problem Oblivion had, but are players meant to actually believe that almost every single location in this game was designed to have some hidden mechanism or pathway so as to form an incredibly convenient loop after someone has wandered to the end of them? If there was more variety to what constitutes a dungeon in Skyrim, dungeons would be more interesting. Think about finding Blackreach for the first time. Discovering this massive underground cavern is one of Skyrim's strongest moments, and a big part of why its discovery is so effective is because it's unexpected, and that this location is unlike any other due to its bigger size and interconnected structure. This is Skyrim's dungeonry at its best, and yet this is a one-off. For the rest of the game, Skyrim's dungeons establish and then conform to many of the same tropes of what a dungeon should be, and these tropes get overly repetitive in a game that is overflowing with dungeons. Worse than this though is how these tropes are clearly the result of the player's needs and desires, not what makes sense for the world. Dungeons are designed around the player in this game. That's why they all have evenly spaced enemy encounters, with evenly spaced loot, with the best loot at the end, and linear structures with incredibly convenient hidden shortcuts. The result is these dungeons don't feel very real. They don't seem like naturally occurring locations that the player just happens to stumble into. They seem like purposefully created levels that exist to cater to the requirements of a video game. These games are meant to be about creating a world players can believe in, but dungeons are the building blocks of this world and they don't seem very believable. And dungeons aren't just a part of this world like they once were in Morrowind, they're the focus of it. Almost every quest in Skyrim revolves around the basic structure of sending the player to a dungeon. This started to be true in Oblivion, which was a shift I theorised was in response to the inclusion of quest markers that removed much of the core challenge of Morrowind's quests, and meant dungeons became the go-to substitute for giving players something to do. But Skyrim is even more dungeon focused than Oblivion, with almost every major quest in this game sending you to one of these places. In Oblivion, there were multiple lengthy side quests that took place entirely in a city, such as Paranoia in Skingrad, or Canvass the Castle in Coral, or Two Sides of a Coin in Bruma. There were also multiple faction questlines that had long stretches of dungeon-free questing, like the Dark Brotherhood and the Thieves Guild. And some of Oblivion's best quests feature no dungeons, which might actually have had a lot to do with why they were the best. By contrast, I went through a list of every single side quest in Skyrim, and while there are several minor side quests that don't feature dungeons of the find 10 bear pelts or deliver a message to this person variety, for lengthy side quests, I could only find 3 that take place entirely outside a dungeon: Blood on the Ice, The Forsworn Conspiracy, and The Book of Love. And just like in Oblivion, these are some of the better side quests in the game, which surely isn't a coincidence. So Skyrim has improved its gameplay loop in numerous small ways, such as providing more rewards and adding shortcuts, and it's also improved the visuals of its dungeons. But the actual gameplay of dungeons remains as shallow as ever, and the way dungeons dominate the quest design leaves quests feeling less interesting. Even worse though is how the vast quantity of dungeons leads to a diminished sense of immersion, as the world is left seeming like it revolves around dungeons, and the dungeons are left seeming like they revolve around the player's needs. This doesn't mean Skyrim is bad. Its gameplay loop still works, its effectiveness has been proven by the game's critical reception, its sales, and its ability to keep players coming back to it years later. But this overwhelming focus on dungeons ignores the game's greatest asset, its world. And this gameplay loop ignores the series' most appealing factor, exploration. So, let's talk about those things. My favourite location in Skyrim is Nightgate Inn. Nothing interesting happens here. You do have a reason to come here during one Dark Brotherhood quest, but otherwise this place is frankly unimportant. It's located in a remote section of the Pale. There are only a couple of inhabitants, which makes sense considering its remoteness. The interior is the same as most other inns in Skyrim, which has always seemed a shame to me, as while this interior design looks good and captures the cultural and tonal feel of the region, inns and taverns seem like such important parts of this world that I've always thought they deserved a few more variants to their layouts. Still, none of this has anything to do with why I like this place. I remember when I first found this inn, back in 2011. I was still near the start of my playthrough, still a newcomer to the land of Skyrim. I'd just arrived at Windhelm for the first time, having went there for some forgotten quest-related business, but rather than head inside the city, I was struck with the urge to look around outside, so I did, and I ended up following the river running west out of a desire to see where it would take me. Nightgate Inn was what I eventually found. The surroundings are quite beautiful here. Really, a lot of Skyrim is. The visual design of their overworlds has for a long time been Bethesda's greatest strength, and Skyrim might be their crowning achievement. Almost everywhere you go in this game, you'll be greeted to stunning vistas that manage to have enough realism to seem believable, yet enough grandeur and style to be able to consistently impress. So maybe Nightgate Inn is nothing out of the ordinary in this regard, but to me there's still something about it. Maybe it's the remoteness. On almost all sides you're surrounded by mountains here, almost like the place is being closed in or hidden away from the rest of the world. The closest settlement is not very close at all, and it's hard to imagine there are many travellers that pass through. The snow seems to fall heavy, and you'd imagine life must be hard here even if this world wasn't full of bandits and bears and trolls and such. And yet here, amidst the cold and the danger, is this inn, sitting here warm and inviting, defiant against its surroundings, offering shelter and safe harbour to the lost, the brave and the foolish. Something about this place speaks to my imagination. It has done since I first stumbled into it. I can't help but wonder what stories this inn has to tell, what life would be like here, and how hard would it really be to keep this inn going. This place seems rather sad to me. Its tranquility is almost idyllic, but it's hard not to imagine that in the long term it's likely doomed. I mean, the owner admits there's almost no traffic through here anymore, and in a dangerous world with conditions this harsh, it feels like one bad winter would be all it takes to bring about its end. But then again, it must have survived okay so far. I love Nightgate Inn. Really, it's not special in any way, but that makes it feel more real to me. It's just a part of this world, and it's okay that it doesn't have a story to tell the player, because not every place needs something for the player, and sometimes your imagination tells a more interesting tale anyway. Most of Skyrim doesn't feel like this. Maybe your imagination is greater than mine, and everywhere you go the act of just seeing places is enough to satisfy you, but for most I imagine that isn't all it takes. Seeing the world is nice, and Bethesda have crafted a world worth seeing, but even a good-looking game needs something more to be fulfilling. There needs to be interaction or engagement, decisions to be made or danger to be faced, rewards to be found or secrets to uncover. There needs to be something. As it is currently, all exploration in Skyrim involves is seeing an icon on your compass and heading in its direction in order to gain a pop-up message and sound effect telling you that this place is discovered, before you then head off to the next grayed out icon to repeat the process until you feel it's time to get back on the track of following your quest marker. Travelling in this world requires little by way of planning. Navigation poses no challenge, enemies you encounter soon become familiar, and there's little by way of reward for one who does wander off the beaten path or take the road less travelled. And that's assuming you don't just fast travel all game, which you could hardly blame players for doing, as Skyrim doesn't provide any incentive not to do this. When it comes to exploration, the only thing Skyrim has going for it is visuals, but visuals should be there to support everything else, rather than being relied on as the main driving force. There are rare examples where Skyrim does live up to its explorative potential. Frostflow Lighthouse is located on Skyrim's northern coast. Most locations you find have a specific type, like camp, cave, standing stone, settlement, and so on, but there are only 2 lighthouses in the game, with the other belonging to Solitude, which means this lonely building just seems like it should be important. This will likely be enough to make the player want to check it out after seeing its unusual icon on their compass. When you do get inside though, you'll be greeted by a blood-splattered corpse. On the deceased is a journal which gives some indication of what went wrong here, but it's only after you search for Lighthouse and find the other family members' journals that you start to get the full picture of a family that moved into their dream house, only to slowly discover that they might not be as alone in their new home as they once thought. Through this, you'll also be given clues to the location of a key hidden on the fireplace, which will unlock the door to the cellar, where you find a tunnel leading to a Chorus cave, which will allow you to take vengeance on the creatures responsible for the family's murder, and find the rest of the unlucky family's remains. This quest is one of the best in the game because it's driven by exploration. You're not led to this location by a quest marker, it's your curiosity that leads you to check it out and gets you to step inside, which makes what you find within more meaningful. Then the next step is once more left up to the player, as it requires you to explore the inside of the lighthouse and read the journals to find the key, which feels more engaging than most quests as the player is required to figure the objective out for themselves. Finally, the last part of the quest could just be another dungeon, but the context for why you're here makes it a lot more than that. Frostflow Lighthouse rewards player curiosity, with the prize being the story of what happened here, and as stories go, it's not a bad one. It's told mostly through the environment, but it's still effective, and Bethesda often seem more comfortable telling tales this way anyway. And so this location proves that exploration can work in Skyrim, and that quests might sometimes be more effective when the designers are willing to take a step back from holding the player's hand to let them discover both the quest and its objectives by themselves. This example isn't typical, however. Generally, there's no reason to enter locations you discover if you don't have a quest telling you to do so. Early in my most recent playthrough, I found a cave called Lost Knife Hideout. Outside were 2 charred and impaled corpses, which was enough to stir my curiosity. I mean, surely you only need to burn or impale someone. Who does both? That's just extra work. I decided I had to meet the one responsible and find that answer myself, so I went inside, where I found bandits. There's no story to this location. There aren't any journals. The bandits don't speak. There isn't anything interesting to discover inside, and there's not even a connection to the corpses outside. It's just normal bandits in a normal cave, which is, unfortunately, a rather normal thing to find in Skyrim. Researching this location afterwards revealed that this is a possible setting for 6 different quest objectives that use random generation to determine their exact location, but as I hadn't generated a quest for this location yet, there was nothing for me to do here. The reward for being curious was 23 minutes of my time wasted killing generic enemies in a generic placeholder location. This experience felt like the game was trying to teach me not to go to a location I don't have a reason to go to, and after enough repeat scenarios, even slow learners will likely pick that message up. In ways like this, Skyrim's quest design discourages exploration, leaving the only exploring you do in this game being walking to places, unlocking them as fast travel destinations, and briefly checking out what they look like from the outside, before moving on to the next icon on the compass. Sometimes, like with Nightgate Inn, that's enough. Skyrim's visual design can be so effective, but just witnessing some of its locations is all that's needed to make the player care about this world and to make them interested in traversing it. Most of the time, however, this isn't enough, and Skyrim's exploration is left feeling empty. This is a beautiful, well-realized, captivating world that's drowning in missed opportunities and wasted potential. Ironically, the only regular exceptions to this I found were the shacks. If you were to judge a location type by its name, this might be surprising, as compared to forts, dwarven ruins, or dragon lairs, shacks sound like they're at a disadvantage. However, due to their small size, these locations are almost guaranteed to not be dungeons, meaning if their designer gave them a purpose, it was likely a narrative one. Not every shack comes with a worthwhile story, and nor should they, but some shack-related highlights include a dog guarding its deceased owner that can be adopted, a slaughtered sect of warrior priests, and a front for a skooma den that's a front for something even more sinister. So if you're looking to find something interesting when wandering the wilderness, shacks might be your best bet. And if the best location type is the one least likely to be a dungeon, and the best side quests are the few lengthy ones with no dungeons in them, maybe that's proof Skyrim has too many dungeons. Why are there so many dungeons in this game? Size matters. In the first episode of this analysis, I explained how one of the draws of these games is their size, and that applies to both the game's world and the amount of content they contain. The various games in this series have had different methods of achieving this vastness, and Skyrim marks the return of one of Daggerfall's best known tricks, procedurally generated content. Rebranded under the new name of Radiant Quests, These quests randomly select target locations for the player to be sent to kill or retrieve a normally generic objective. These are usually handed out by innkeepers, stewards, or faction members, and through this system the game is able to generate an infinite number of quests that will continually be regenerated to send players to new dungeons, or old dungeons that the game will repopulate. A classic example of a Radiant quest is Kill the Bandit Leader. That's the name of the quest, not the objective, although it's also the objective, which kind of speaks for itself really. There's no quest dialogue for many of these quests, just a note and a list of 28 different locations that the player might be sent to. If there was an option before starting the game that explained what Radiant quests are and gave players the option to turn them on or off, how many people would choose to include them in the game? My guess is almost everyone would choose to opt out, and those few who opt in would probably only do so because they were too lazy to check what they were actually opting into. Radiant quests are just worse versions of normal quests. Their objectives are generic, their stories are non-existent, and instead of sending you to the more interesting, higher effort dungeons, they instead send you to the least interesting, lower effort dungeons. They feel like a waste of time, but the problems they create go deeper than this because they dilute the real quest pool, as even for those who know of their existence, it's not always easy to determine what is and isn't a Radiant quest. They also alter the structure and feel of faction quest lines. Factions in Skyrim rely heavily on Radiant quests. If you ignore these quests, the faction quest lines will feel a lot shorter than other Elder Scrolls games. For example, without Radiant quests, there are only 6 quests for the Companions, the Skyrim equivalent of the Fighters Guild, whereas Oblivion had 20 and Morrowind had 31. Ignoring Radiant quests also changes the feel of factions. Whereas in other games you started as a low rank member and had to slowly work your way up, in Skyrim every faction is quick to throw you into a main story that revolves heavily around the importance of the player, despite the fact you only just joined. For the Mages Guild, this means rather than getting to spend a decent amount of time immersing yourself into the College of Winterhold, where you'd get to live out your dreams of being a student of magic, getting into mischief, making friends, and learning ancient secrets, you instead get sent straight into a much less interesting main quest, full of dungeons, and then before you even get to attend your second lesson, you've somehow become the new Archmage. So much for your magical education. Honestly, you can't really do anything in this game without ending up the leader of some useless faction, but for the College of Winterhold it really hurts. This place should have been the best mage guild an Elder Scrolls game had ever seen. The setting is perfect. The Thieves Guild and Dark Brotherhood have different, but still Radiant-induced problems, where it's Radiant quests that feature the main activities that give these factions their identities. So, most of the thieving and assassinating comes at the hand of a Radiant quest, but the quests themselves are entirely forgettable. In Oblivion, thievery and assassinating were the best parts of these factions, and yet now these types of quests are so basic they don't even seem worth doing. And so, Radiant quests aren't just a form of uninteresting content, they're a form of uninteresting content that makes the rest of the game less interesting as well, which makes it hard to understand what the benefit of these quests was meant to be, because just how much content does one game actually need? To complete every non-Radiant quest in Skyrim would still take the average player at least 100 hours, and who expects more than 100 hours of content from a single player game? It almost seems like they exist just to create the illusion of more content in order to impress players who don't look too closely. A bit like diametic behaviour in animals, where they try to puff themselves up to keep away predators, which must work or these animals wouldn't bother, but that doesn't stop it looking ridiculous to anyone who knows better. This might also explain why there's so many dungeons. Skyrim has 195 dungeons. Who is the person that wants to do 195 of these things? And if 195 weren't enough, they also repopulate after a certain number of days, so you get to do them all over again. Saying that out loud makes it sound like someone's own personalised version of ironic hell. I can imagine some unlucky fool in the afterlife told their soul shall remain in eternal damnation until they clear all 195 of Skyrim's dungeons. And then, every time they get close, the dungeons start repopulating, leaving them forever unable to escape. If someone did end up in the Skyrim dungeon version of hell, at least they'd be able to make use of the legendary skill system. Legendary skills were introduced in patch 1.9 to allow players to continue to level after maxing out one of their skills by choosing to make that skill legendary. This resets the player's level in that skill from 100 to 15 and refunds their perks, making them weaker and allowing them to level the skill up all over again, which can then be done repeatedly. The best comparison to this system is Prestige mode in Call of Duty, which resets your rank and unlockables while giving you a new modified shiny icon, but I always assumed the point of Prestige mode was just to show off to other players. Except, Skyrim is a single player game, so there's no one to show off to. I suppose maybe you could ask your parents to come check out your elite Skyrim legendary rank. They might be kind enough to humour you at least. God, that sounds depressing. Why did Bethesda feel the need to add this system? Why are there 195 dungeons? Why do dungeons repopulate? Why are there Radiant quests? It's like all that mattered to Bethesda was making the biggest game possible, but it's not worth sacrificing quality in your mad quest for quantity, not to mention there's a better way to make an RPG with a near endless amount of content, which is through replayability. This is something Bethesda have seemingly turned their back on, with Skyrim moving to a classless system where one character is meant to feel like they can do everything and there's no more birth signs, specialization or major skills to set one character apart from another. To go alongside this, you can join every faction, become their leader almost overnight, be named Thane of every city, even those at war with each other, and then become the champion of every Daedric prince. I'm guessing no one in Skyrim has ever heard the term conflict of interest before. The only exception is the Civil War, which lets you choose which side to support, and as a result, ends up feeling like the most defining part of your entire playthrough. The Civil War itself isn't very good. Many of its quests are repetitive fort attacks, the narrative is regularly forced to take a back seat, the big battles feel pathetically small scale, and the land itself never really manages to successfully feel like a country at war. But despite all these problems, the Civil War still ends up being a great addition to the game, just on the strength of that one single meaningful choice. Stormcloaks or Imperials. That is a decision that matters to players, and even 10 years later people still argue about it. Hell, there are probably people arguing about it right now in the comments section of this video. And to those people I say, you do you. I'll take arguments over fictional video game politics in my comments section over arguments over non-fictional real-life politics any day. Still, I wish there were more meaningful choices in Skyrim. There is a decision regarding the fate of Paarthurnax as part of the main questline, as well as Cicero in the Dark Brotherhood, and a major decision in the first DLC, Dawnguard, and a few branching paths in some of the better side quests and Daedric quests, but it still doesn't feel like enough. This game would have benefited greatly from more choices with tangible consequences on the world around you, and it's not like there wasn't ample opportunity. For example, the companion questline revolves around the werewolf companions feuding with the werewolf hunters, the Silver Hand, and yet instead of depicting the Silver Hand with nuance and giving the player a choice over which group to side with, the Silver Hand are instead depicted as two-dimensional villains that the player has no choice but to slaughter. If this type of choice requires a sacrifice of quantity to achieve, I'd still consider that worth it just to get a couple more Stormcloaks or Imperials in the game. Likewise, a progression system that allows for unique character builds which cater to different playstyles isn't a bad thing. Skyrim has a tendency for player characters to all end up being the same, but a powerful warrior well versed in magic that knows how to shoot a bow from stealth and pick a difficult lock might be a useful character, but it isn't an interesting one. Skyrim's chronic lack of inbuilt replayability might be one of the major factors that drives the player base's fascination with mods. To be clear, mods are a difficult aspect to address in any analysis, especially for a game whose selection of user-created content is so vast and rich. Bethesda do deserve a huge amount of credit for their long-standing tradition of both allowing modification of their games and of trying to make the act of modification user-friendly. There have, of course, been some hiccups along the way, but if more game developers were as mod-friendly as Bethesda, the world would be a better place. I've always disliked the narrative that developers allow mods to get away with creating unfinished games, or that developers create unfinished games because they know modders will pick up the slack. Such ideas are unpalatably cynical, even for me, and my capacity for cynicism is not easily reached. Also, if it were true, we'd see a lot more big-budget games with thriving modding communities. That said, I also dislike the idea that the existence of mods, which may fix a game's flaws, serve as a get-out-of-jail-free card when it comes to discussions of those flaws. This is for several reasons. Firstly, most people don't even use mods. Secondly, mods can come with their own problems, and I don't just mean in regards to a game's stability, which certainly can be a factor for the over-enthusiastic mod user, but also in regards to the content of the mod itself. Just because you claim to fix something doesn't mean you fix it well. Just ask the guy who did my roof. Thirdly, mods are separate entities from the game itself, and both the game and the mod deserve to be judged as such. And lastly, mods aren't retroactive. Oblivion's level scaling is poorly implemented, and no mod in the world will ever change my mind because that mod is not strictly a part of Oblivion, and that mod will not allow me to go back in time and replay that game with the mod in place. If someone has reached the point where they're complaining about something, there's a good chance the damage has already been done. So mods are a difficult aspect to discuss when analysing a game, which is why, despite their monumental importance to the Elder Scrolls series, I've relegated their discussion to a truncated off-topic tangent to be carefully taken before quickly course-correcting back to my original point, which is that mods are one of the best ways to add replayability to a game, and the Elder Scrolls games repeatedly show this. The idea of heavily modding a game is almost as enjoyable as the end result, because through change, mods are able to reintroduce excitement back into something that's excitement may previously have been sucked dry. And the fact that the Elder Scrolls fanbase are so in love with mods might partly be because mods act as a very effective supplement to one of Skyrim's major deficiencies. Quantity does matter in these games. The size of these worlds is part of what makes them so believable, and it's part of what makes the prospect of exploring them so enticing. But the pursuit of quantity doesn't matter so much that it should be allowed to justify a decrease in quality. With Radiant quests, the vast number of dungeons, dungeon repopulation, and legendary skills, it feels like Bethesda are creating their game for a type of player that doesn't even exist. Skyrim doesn't need to be never-ending, and it doesn't benefit from this approach, but if Bethesda did want to achieve the degree of quantity that they seem to want their games to include, focusing on increasing replayability is probably the best solution. At this point, it seems we've reached the stage where I'm struggling to talk about these games without veering off into what I would do differently territory, which I guess means it's about time to wrap this month-long life-consuming project up. There are certain things every game can improve at. For example, it's always possible that a game could have better graphics, better writing, better gameplay, more content, and so on. When one game noticeably drops the ball in a certain one of these areas, We might say that this game should have been better in this regard, but most of the time we don't need to say these things, because while it would of course be nice if a game was better in these areas, everyone knows this already. And the people who actually made the game will know it better than most. After all, a creator has an intimacy with their creation's flaws that other people will never understand. But there is a different type of criticism that can be made, one that's arguably more important. Rather than focusing on the end result, you can instead be critical of the thought process taken to get there, the reasons behind the game, the design philosophy. Skyrim would benefit from better combat, but that goes without saying, and even if we know nothing of the Elder Scrolls 6, we can still be confident that efforts will be taken to improve combat. That doesn't guarantee those efforts will be a success, but an attempt will be made. However, there are other areas that I believe to be just as, if not more important, to any future game's success that won't necessarily receive any attention and that might not even be considered problems by the ones making the game, and 3 of these in particular seem worthy of greater consideration. In the first video in this series, I tried to explain why people like these games so much, and how Morrowind got many things right. In the second video, I looked at the changes made by Oblivion, and argued that the results brought by these were mixed. In this video, I tried to do something a little different, however. The first 2 parts were meant to examine the changes Skyrim made, and what the actual game is like to play, but the final 3 parts of this video were each meant to lead into one of these 3 larger problems that I believe have come to define Bethesda's approach to game design. These are how the worlds have come to be designed as video games first, how exploration is no longer a part of the core gameplay, and lastly, how meaningful choice and replayability have been made too low a priority. The first of these is still the most important in my eyes. Skyrim is a world of dungeons, and dungeons are artificial constructs centered around the player. Dungeons shouldn't feel like the main focus of these worlds. These games have always featured dungeons, there are advantages of dungeons, dungeons don't need to be removed, but the world shouldn't revolve around them. This is in part because the dungeons just aren't good enough to carry so much of the game's weight, but more importantly, it's because dungeons aren't the reason people are drawn to these games. They aren't the highlights of the time players spend in these worlds, they aren't the reason the series became a success, and they aren't worthy of so much of the game's focus. Dungeons have improved with each game in this series, but the rest of the world almost seems to have been forgotten. Skyrim cities are tiny. The capital, Solitude, has 17 buildings. There are 195 dungeons in this game, but the capital city of this entire province only gets 17 buildings. The entire population of Skyrim is 1,016. This is every single named character in the game. Meanwhile, in an 80-hour playthrough, the number of people I've killed is 1,221. So just the bandit population that has died by my hands is greater than the entire population of Skyrim. And don't even get me started on the quest design again. People are right when they say Oblivion has better quests than Skyrim, but it's not because of the writing, it's because Oblivion has more variety in quest objectives, and overall, less dungeon-related tunnel vision. The Elder Scrolls games set themselves apart from so many others by creating worlds that were bigger, more immersive and more interactive. These traits still make these games stand out, but they're all for nothing if the design of these worlds doesn't place enough importance on its believability. For these games to live up to their full potential, the world design has to be allowed to take priority over the way their worlds function as games. To that end, exploration should be embraced. For this to be achieved, exploration needs to have more to it than Oblivion or Skyrim provided. Maybe the easiest way to accomplish this would be to introduce more limited quest markers, as discussed in the previous video. This could be particularly effective when it comes to travelling around the overworld, as with the graphical fidelity of a modern game, there's no reason mountains or ruins or other features can't serve as easily visible landmarks for the player to find through visuals alone. There's also more radical solutions to the exploration problem. One thing I would love to see attempted is to remove the player from the map, so that the player must learn to take an active role in navigation. I think allowing quest markers on a map with no player icons actually has greater potential for connecting exploration to gameplay in a fulfilling way than the other way around, although there are reasons a major title might be hesitant to attempt such a thing. It would require a serious commitment to going against the norm, but that wouldn't be a first for the series. Still, there are ways exploration could be improved just through learning from what works in Skyrim itself. Frostflow Lighthouse stands out as one such example. The point is, something needs to be done to incorporate exploration into the main activity players do in the game. People want to explore these worlds, so give them a reason to. Don't take players' desire to explore for granted. Finally, if the Elder Scrolls is meant to be an easily accessible RPG, then that's okay. It's easy to understand why the series went in that direction from a commercial perspective. That's what many games have done to try to reach the widest audience possible, and with such a large audience, should come a budget that can do the scale and immersiveness of these worlds justice. Also, have you seen Shirley Curry, aka Skyrim Grandma? That's pretty wholesome, and I don't want to be against that. But I don't see why increasing the number of meaningful choices in either character building or the narrative has to mean inaccessibility. If you want to make a game that has lots of content, which Bethesda clearly do, replayability is the best way. I feel like this is something that should be possible to prove mathematically, like replayability is by nature multiplicative rather than additive, therefore the amount of content can be increased exponentially. That theory may need some additional work, but regardless, choice matters beyond replayability, and this is something that shouldn't be neglected. These are, of course, just what I believe to be the most important problems facing the series. These issues are connected to what I feel has been lost with time in more recent iterations, but they're also closely related to what I believe to be the most important aspects of these games, as identified in the first episode of this analysis. Bethesda's idea of the most important problems facing the series are probably not very similar to mine. The Elder Scrolls 6 may be a way off, but Fallout 4 is already a way in. And if it serves as any indication of Bethesda's design philosophy, it suggests that the role of dungeons as the centre of their design universe remains as true as ever. In fact, Fallout 4 goes several steps further in this regard, with the introduction of a scavenging system designed to more closely connect the looting aspect of the gameplay loop with the character progression systems, as well as the introduction of randomly generated legendary enemies and legendary weapons to add some of the addictive chance-based itemization of popular action RPGs. These additions may have positive ramifications on the core gameplay, but they also act as a stark reaffirmation of Bethesda's overall direction, and I wouldn't really expect any change from this. The reality is, the changes made by Skyrim worked. This is a multi-award winning title, it's the best-selling RPG of all time, and maybe this isn't in spite of the changes I've highlighted, it's because of them. Skyrim excels at its simple dungeon crawling formula. Players are drawn in by the visuals and scope of its world, and its gameplay loop is effortless to fall into and satisfying enough to keep many players engaged, so it's hard not to admit that in most ways, Skyrim should be considered a huge success. And Skyrim is a good game. And yet, after successfully coercing players to sink in enough time to put most other single-player video games to shame, I don't think Skyrim leaves players with much to show for it. Spending large amounts of time in this world doesn't make that world seem more believable, it does the opposite. You don't walk away with a plethora of interesting stories. And the destination doesn't seem to make up for many of the journey's shortcomings. Skyrim is a good game, and yet it could have been so much more than that, and years later its legacy doesn't look as bright as it once did. Many people have accused this game of being shallow and overly casual. There's a bitterness that permeates its discussions, an underlying sense of wasted potential from a once great company that lost its way, and I think this is mostly because Skyrim was good enough to make people want it to be better. The seed of the entire Elder Scrolls series is a promise of stepping into another world, of exploring, adventuring, and losing yourself within its virtual confines. That seed is as apparent in Skyrim as it is any other game in this series, maybe even more so. There are many positive qualities this game has, and the advances in gameplay and graphics make that promise even more desirable than it's ever been before. But Skyrim failed to deliver on that promise to many who played it. Its world invites you to look closely, but then fails to live up to that higher degree of scrutiny. Exploration seems like it should be exciting, but soon reveals itself to be shallow. And to achieve its vast quantity of content, the believability of the world itself ended up being undermined. At 13 minutes and 37 seconds into the first video in this series, I referred to the fanbase of these games as being like jaded ex-lovers. I postulated that this might explain the flavour of criticism these games receive, with the implication being not just that this criticism comes from a place of emotion, but also that this criticism is, in some ways, a kind of backhanded compliment. That if these games were good enough to make people fall in love with them in the first place, then that still says something in their favour. There are a lot of open world games these days, but I don't think any have done what the Elder Scrolls games do and done it better. For all their flaws, that childlike dream of stepping into another world is still more alive in these games than any others in my eyes. Which is why the disregard of that dream shown in Skyrim's own design is disappointing to me. And the fact that Skyrim is a good game despite this, and became the best-selling RPG of all time, just makes it seem like that dream is closer and closer to being lost. I suppose, now that you've stuck with me for 5 hours, I should admit that the basis of my ex-lover theory comes from personal experience. I loved this series. The Elder Scrolls was like the first serious long-term relationship of my gaming dating life. I thought it was the one, that it understood me, that of all the games that are made, it was the one that was designed just for me. I guess I was young and naive. I didn't understand that things would change for both of us. A lot has happened since those early days, but I'll always cherish those memories. I've never felt as connected to any virtual world as I did with you back then. And now I'm getting older, I wonder if I'll ever feel that way about a virtual world again. I know you've gotten older too. I guess you've moved on. But I still wonder sometimes if you miss it. And I know you've achieved a lot. It's incredible really looking at how far you've come. But you had a passion back then. There was a spark. You understood what it meant to dream. And I just hope you still understand that. I hear you're with a new guy now. One with more money than me. I hope it works out for you. I moved on too, you know. Actually, I ended up starting a YouTube channel. You'd never guess what it's about. And it's been going pretty well. Although sometimes the videos do get a little weird. Well, this isn't exactly how I expected I'd end this series. But here we are. Hey, Elder Scrolls, if you're listening, hit me up sometime. We should go for a coffee. You know, catch up on old times. Talk about ideas. I've been wanting to talk to you about that perk system.